The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of Redemption Springs, kicking up a cloud of dust that momentarily obscured the weathered sign welcoming visitors to the small frontier town. Pearl Bennett clutched her valise tightly against her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs as she peered through the grimy window at what would be her new home. After 2 months of correspondence with a man she'd never met, she had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston to marry him. "End of the line for you, miss," the driver called down as he secured the reins. Pearl smoothed her travel-worn skirt and adjusted her bonnet before accepting the driver's calloused hand. As her feet touched the dusty ground of the main street, she took in the rough-hewn buildings that lined either side a general store, a blacksmith, and the ominously large saloon that dominated the far end of the street. "Thank you, sir," she said, handing over her last coin as a tip. "Could you direct me to Mr. Harold Jenkins' residence?" The driver's expression changed, a flicker of something pity perhaps crossing his weathered face. "Jenkins, you say?" He scratched his beard. "Might want to check at the saloon. Man spends more time there than at his own homestead." He tipped his hat awkwardly before climbing back onto his perch. "Good luck to you, miss." The stagecoach rattled away, leaving Pearl alone in the unfamiliar street with nothing but her small valise and the letter promising her a new life as Mrs. Harold Jenkins. She was 22 years old, and after losing her parents to influenza the previous winter, the advertisement in the Boston Chronicle offering a home and security in exchange for matrimony had seemed like divine providence. Drawing a deep breath, Pearl straightened her shoulders and walked purposefully toward the saloon. The wooden boardwalk creaked beneath her boots, and she could feel curious eyes following her progress from behind curtained windows. A proper lady wouldn't be caught dead entering a saloon, but she had no choice. If Mr. Jenkins was inside, she needed to find him. The swinging doors of the Lucky Strike Saloon loomed before her. Pearl hesitated only a moment before pushing through. The smoky interior was a shock after the bright May sunshine of 1878. The piano player missed a note as heads turned in her direction. Conversations faltered, and the clink of glasses stilled. "I'm looking for Mr. Harold Jenkins," she announced, her voice steadier than she felt. A round man with an impressive mustache rose from a corner table. Well, if it isn't my mail-order bride finally arrived." His words slurred slightly, and the empty whiskey glass in front of him suggested it wasn't his first drink of the day. Pearl moved toward him, relief washing over her despite his disheveled appearance. At least her journey hadn't been in vain. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm pleased to finally meet you." She extended her gloved hand. "I'm Pearl Bennett." Instead of taking her hand, Jenkins circled her slowly, examining her like livestock at auction. The photograph didn't do you justice, did it, boys?" he called out to the room. "She's scrawnier than I expected." Uncomfortable laughter rippled through the saloon. "Sir, perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private," Pearl suggested quietly, conscious of the many eyes watching them. "Private?" Jenkins bellowed. "Why, these are all my friends. They've been waiting to see what $500 would buy me." He grabbed her arm roughly. "Come on, let's give them a proper look at Harold Jenkins' mail-order bride." Before Pearl could protest, he yanked her forward, causing her to stumble. Her valise fell from her grasp, spilling her few belongings onto the dirty saloon floor. The patrons erupted in cruel laughter as Jenkins dragged her through the room. "Look here, boys, city girl thinks she's ready for frontier life." Jenkins paraded her between the tables while men hooted and made crude remarks about her appearance. Tears of humiliation stung Pearl's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Please, Mr. Jenkins, this isn't proper," he mocked her refined accent. "We don't much care for proper out here, do we, fellas?" let her go." The voice cut through the laughter like a knife. The saloon fell silent as everyone turned toward the bar where a tall man had risen from his seat. His face was partially shadowed by his hat, but his stance was unmistakably threatening. "Mind your own business, Fraser," Jenkins sneered, but his grip on Pearl's arm loosened slightly. The man stepped forward, and Pearl could see him clearly for the first time. He was lean and weathered, with deep-set blue eyes that blazed with quiet fury. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and the gun at his hip looked well used. "I said, let her go." The man Fraser moved closer, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. "This here's my bride," Jenkins protested, though with noticeably less conviction. "Paid good money for her to come all the way from Boston." Fraser's gaze shifted to Pearl, taking in her disheveled appearance and the dignity with which she held herself, despite the circumstances. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit who didn't belong in this rough-edged town. "She may have agreed to marry you," Fraser said evenly, "but I doubt she agreed to be treated like a prize heifer at the county fair." Jenkins' face darkened with anger, but before he could respond, Fraser continued, "Now, I'll say it one more time. Let her go." With a muttered curse, Jenkins released Pearl's arm and took a step back. Fraser turned his attention to the room at large. "Anyone else find this amusing?" His hand rested casually near his holster. "Anyone else want to laugh at this lady's expense?" One brave or foolish soul in the back chuckled. In a fluid motion that Pearl could barely follow, Fraser crossed the room, grabbed the man by his shirt collar and slammed him against the wall. "You think it's funny, Watson?" Fraser growled. "You think humiliating a woman is something to laugh about?" "And no, Fraser," Watson stammered. "Was just clearing my throat is all." Fraser released him with a disgusted push and turned back to survey the room. Anyone else need to clear their throat? The silence was absolute. Fraser walked over to where Pearl's belongings were scattered on the floor and crouched down, carefully gathering her items and returning them to her valise. When he straightened, he handed the bag to her with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his previous actions. "Miss, I believe you deserve better than what you found here." He spoke quietly, meant for her ears alone. "If you'd allow me, I can take you to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. It's clean and respectable." Pearl glanced at Jenkins, who was now slumped in a chair, his earlier bravado deflated by Fraser's intervention. "What about my arrangement with Mr. Jenkins?" she asked softly. Fraser's jaw tightened. "A man who'd treat you like this before you're even wed isn't a man worth marrying." He offered his arm. "The choice is yours, but I'd recommend giving yourself some time to consider your options in this town before tying yourself to anyone." Pearl hesitated only a moment before placing her hand on his offered arm. "Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Flynn," he corrected. "Flynn Fraser." As they turned to leave, Jenkins found his voice again. "You can't just take my property, Fraser. I paid for her passage." Flynn stopped and turned slowly. The look in his eyes made Jenkins shrink back in his chair. "She's a woman, not property," Flynn said, his voice dangerously low. "And if you want to discuss payment, I'd be happy to settle your account." His hand drifted toward his gun. Jenkins raised his hands in surrender. "No need for that, just a misunderstanding." Flynn nodded once, then guided Pearl toward the saloon doors. Just before they reached them, a voice from the corner called out, "Looks like Fraser's sweet on the mail-order bride." "What's the matter, Jenkins? Can't even keep a woman you bought and paid for." The laughter that followed was cut short as Flynn turned, releasing Pearl's arm. In 3 long strides, he reached the table where a red-headed man sat with a smirk on his face. Without warning, Flynn's fist connected with the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. "Anyone else?" Flynn asked calmly, looking around the room. Two men rushed him from behind. Flynn ducked under one punch and delivered a crushing blow to the attacker's midsection. The second man managed to land a hit on Flynn's shoulder before receiving an elbow to the face that sent him reeling back into a table. More men joined the fray, whether out of loyalty to Jenkins or simply looking for a fight. Pearl couldn't tell. She pressed herself against the wall as the saloon erupted into chaos. Flynn moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been in his share of fights. He blocked a chair swung at his head and used the momentum to throw his attacker into another oncoming man. A bottle shattered against the wall inches from his face, but he barely flinched as he delivered a powerful uppercut to the man who'd thrown it. Pearl watched in a mixture of horror and amazement as Flynn methodically fought every man who had laughed at her expense. Despite being outnumbered, he held his own, his movements precise and controlled. When the last man slumped to the floor, Flynn stood in the center of the saloon, breathing hard but still on his feet. He straightened his hat, which had somehow remained on his head throughout the melee, and walked back to Pearl. "I believe we were leaving," he said calmly, as if he hadn't just fought half the men in Redemption Springs. Outside, the bright sunlight made Pearl blink. Flynn guided her down the boardwalk, putting distance between them and the saloon. "Are you hurt?" he asked, examining her arm where Jenkins had grabbed her. "No, I'm fine," she assured him, though the humiliation still burned in her chest. "Why did you do that? You don't even know me." Flynn's pace slowed as he considered her question. "My mother taught me that how a man treats women tells you everything you need to know about his character." He looked away toward the distant mountains. "I've seen enough cruelty in this world. Didn't need to see more today." They walked in silence until they reached a neat two-story house with a sign reading Holloway's boarding house. "Mrs. Holloway is fair and doesn't tolerate nonsense," Flynn explained. "You'll be safe here while you decide what to do next." Pearl clutched her valise tighter. "I don't have much money left. I spent nearly everything on the journey here." Flynn nodded understandingly. "Mrs. Holloway always needs help with cooking and cleaning. I'm sure you can work out an arrangement." He hesitated. "And if you need anything, my ranch is just north of town." Ask anyone for directions to Fraser's place. The door to the boarding house opened before Pearl could respond, revealing a plump, middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression. "Flynn Fraser, what trouble have you brought to my doorstep now?" she asked, though her tone held no real reproach. "Mrs. Holloway, this is Miss Pearl Bennett. She's new in town and needs a place to stay." Mrs. Holloway's sharp eyes took in Pearl's appearance, noting her quality clothing despite the travel wear and the barely concealed distress in her face. "Another one of Jenkins' mail-order brides?" she asked bluntly. Pearl felt her cheeks flush. "Yes, madam," Mrs. Holloway clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "That man should be run out of town. Third one this year, and it's only May." She stepped aside. "Come in, dear, we'll get you settled." Pearl turned to Flynn. "Thank you, Mr. Fraser. I don't know how I'll repay your kindness." "Just Flynn," he corrected again with a small smile, "and there's nothing to repay. Any decent man would have done the same." Mrs. Holloway snorted. "Except there aren't many decent men left in Redemption Springs." She gestured for Pearl to enter, though Flynn here might be one of the few. Flynn tipped his hat to both women. "I'll be heading back to the ranch." "Miss Bennett, I hope you find what you're looking for in Redemption Springs, despite its rough welcome." As he walked away, Pearl couldn't help but notice the straight line of his shoulders and the quiet confidence in his stride. For the first time since arriving in this dusty frontier town, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps her journey hadn't been in vain after all. Inside the boarding house, Mrs. Holloway showed Pearl to a small but clean room on the second floor. "It's not much," the older woman said, "but it's yours for as long as you need it." "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway, but as I mentioned to Mr. Fraser, I don't have much money left." Mrs. Holloway waved away her concern. "Flynn already took care of your first week. After that, we can discuss you helping around the house in exchange for your room and board." Pearl's eyes widened. "He paid for my stay. But why would he do that?" The older woman smiled knowingly. "That's just Flynn's way. He doesn't say much, but his actions speak volumes." She sat on the edge of the narrow bed. "Now, tell me what happened at the saloon. Word travels fast in a town this size, and I'd rather hear it from you than through the gossip mill." As Pearl recounted the humiliating experience and Flynn's intervention, Mrs. Holloway's expression darkened. "That Harold Jenkins is a disgrace," she declared when Pearl finished. "He's pulled this trick before. Convinces Eastern women to come out here with promises of marriage, then humiliates them for the entertainment of his drinking buddies. What happened to the other women?" "One went back east immediately, the other." Mrs. Holloway's face softened. "She's married to the blacksmith now. Sometimes things work out in unexpected ways." "And Flynn?" Pearl couldn't help asking. "What's his story?" Mrs. Holloway stood and smoothed her apron. "That's not my tale to tell, dear. Flynn keeps to himself mostly, runs his ranch and comes to town for supplies every couple of weeks." She moved toward the door. "Rest now. Supper's at 6, and you look like you could use some decent food after your journey." Left alone, Pearl unpacked her meager belongings and washed her face in the basin provided. As she looked out the window at the main street of Redemption Springs, she wondered what the future held for her in this strange, wild place, and why thoughts of a quiet cowboy with fierce blue eyes kept returning to her mind. The next morning, Pearl woke to sunlight streaming through the simple curtains. For a moment, she was disoriented, expecting the gentle rocking of the stagecoach or the cramped quarters of the boarding houses along her journey. Then yesterday's events came flooding back, bringing with them a fresh wave of humiliation. She dressed carefully in one of her 2 remaining clean dresses, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days, and made her way downstairs. The dining room was empty except for Mrs. Holloway, who was setting out plates for breakfast. "Good morning, dear," the older woman greeted her. "Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you." It wasn't entirely true. Pearl had spent much of the night replaying the saloon incident and wondering what she would do now, but the bed had been clean and comfortable. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Holloway said as she placed a plate of eggs and bacon before Pearl. "The general store is looking for someone to help with inventory and serving customers. The owner's wife just had their 4th child, and she can't manage the store and the baby." Pearl's spirits lifted. "I worked in a mercantile in Boston. I'm good with numbers and keeping track of inventory." "Perfect. I'll introduce you to Mr. Cooper after breakfast." True to her word, Mrs. Holloway escorted Pearl to Cooper's general store an hour later. Mr. Cooper, a balding man with kind eyes, listened as Mrs. Holloway explained Pearl's situation, tactfully omitting the details of the saloon incident. "Well, Miss Bennett, I can't offer much in wages, but if you're willing to work hard, the position is yours," Mr. Cooper said after asking a few questions about her experience. "Thank you, Mr. Cooper. I'll do my very best." As Pearl was arranging a display of fabric bolts later that morning, the bell above the door jingled. She looked up to see Flynn Fraser enter, ducking his head slightly to clear the doorframe. "Mr. Fraser," she greeted him, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "Miss Bennett." He removed his hat, revealing dark blonde hair that curled slightly at the ends. "I see you've found employment already." "Yes, thanks to Mrs. Holloway's recommendation." She set aside the fabric she was holding. "I wanted to thank you properly for your help yesterday. And for paying for my room at the boarding house." Flynn shrugged uncomfortably. "It was nothing." "It wasn't nothing to me." Pearl met his eyes directly. "You were the only one who stood up for me. I won't forget that." A hint of color appeared on his tanned cheeks. "Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't. You did." Flynn broke eye contact first, turning to examine a shelf of tobacco. "I just came in for some supplies." Pearl recognized his desire to change the subject. "Of course. What can I help you with?" As she gathered the items on his list, coffee, flour, ammunition for his rifle, and a few other staples, Pearl found herself stealing glances at the tall cowboy. In the daylight, without the tension of the previous day, she could see that he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s. His face was weathered from sun and wind, but handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw and those startling blue eyes. "Will that be all, Mr. Fraser?" she asked when she'd assembled his purchases. "Flynn," he corrected for the third time, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "And yes, that's everything." As she tallied his purchases, Pearl gathered her courage. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you have a ranch north of town." Flynn nodded. "Nothing fancy. A small cattle operation my father started. I took over when he passed 5 years ago. You manage it alone?" "I have a couple of hands who help with the cattle. And my younger brother, Finn, though he's more interested in raising horses than cattle." Flynn paid for his supplies and gathered them into a saddle bag. "You should come see it sometime. If you'd like to, that is." The invitation seemed to surprise him as much as it did Pearl. "I'd like that," she replied softly. Flynn settled his hat back on his head. "I'll be back in town next Saturday for supplies. Perhaps you could ride back with me for Sunday dinner if Mrs. Holloway doesn't mind. I'll ask her." Flynn nodded once more, then turned to leave. At the door he paused. "Miss Bennett?" "Yes. I'm glad you're staying in Redemption Springs." Then he was gone, the bell jingling in his wake. Pearl stood motionless behind the counter, a warm feeling spreading through her chest. For the first time since arriving in this frontier town, she felt like perhaps she had found a place where she might belong after all. The week passed quickly, as Pearl settled into her new routine. Working at Cooper's General Store provided her with not only wages, but also introductions to most of the townspeople. Many were kind, though she noticed some of the women eyeing her with suspicion. No doubt they had heard about her arrival as a mail-order bride and the subsequent scene at the saloon. Harold Jenkins had made himself scarce, which suited Pearl just fine. According to town gossip relayed by Mrs. Holloway, he'd been nursing his wounded pride at a friend's ranch outside of town. By Saturday morning, Pearl found herself watching the clock, anticipating Flynn's arrival. She had asked Mrs. Holloway about the Sunday dinner invitation, and the older woman had encouraged her to go. "Flynn Fraser is one of the good ones," Mrs. Holloway had said. "Not like those rowdy cowboys who come into town looking for trouble. His father raised him right before the consumption took him." Around midday, Pearl was arranging a new shipment of canned goods when the store bell rang. She looked up, expecting to see Flynn, but instead found herself face to face with Harold Jenkins. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice lacking the drunken slur from their first meeting. "I've come to apologize for my behavior last week." Pearl straightened, keeping the counter between them. "Mr. Jenkins." He twisted his hat in his hands. "I was drunk and showing off for my friends." It was inexcusable. "Yes, it was," Pearl agreed, not making it easy for him. Jenkins cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The thing is, our arrangement still stands if you want it to. I've got a good homestead, 80 acres with a solid house. It needs a woman's touch, but it could be a fine home." Pearl considered the man before her. Sober, he seemed less threatening, even somewhat pathetic, but the memory of being dragged through the saloon like a prize heifer was still too fresh. "Mr. Jenkins, I came west in good faith, believing your letters about wanting a partner in life. What I found was a man who saw me as property to be mocked for entertainment. I don't think we would suit." Jenkins's face darkened. "It's Fraser, isn't it? You've set your cap for him already." "My decision has nothing to do with Mr. Fraser," Pearl said firmly, though the cowboy's face did flash in her mind. "It has everything to do with how you treated me." "You'll regret this," Jenkins muttered. "Fraser's not the marrying kind, too busy brooding over his past to build a future." Before Pearl could respond, the bell rang again and Flynn entered the store. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Jenkins. "Jenkins," he acknowledged coolly. "Fraser." Jenkins jammed his hat back on his head. "Just leaving." He turned back to Pearl. "Think about what I said, Miss Bennett. My offer won't stand forever." After Jenkins left, Flynn approached the counter. "Everything all right?" Pearl nodded. "He came to apologize, believe it or not, and to renew his offer of marriage, I'd wager." Flynn's perceptiveness surprised her. "Yes, though I declined." Something that might have been relief flickered across Flynn's features. "Smart decision." He gestured to his wagon outside. "I've finished my business in town. Are you still interested in seeing the ranch tomorrow?" "Very much so." "What time will we leave?" "I thought perhaps you might want to come today, stay the night. My brother's wife, Sarah, is eager to meet you." Flynn must have noticed Pearl's hesitation because he quickly added, "You'd have your own room, of course, and Sarah would be there the whole time." Pearl considered the offer. The proper thing would be to decline. She barely knew this man, after all. But something about Flynn Fraser made her trust him, and the prospect of seeing his ranch, of escaping the curious eyes of the townspeople for a day, was appealing. "Let me speak with Mrs. Holloway and pack a few things," she decided. An hour later, Pearl found herself seated beside Flynn in his wagon, heading north out of Redemption Springs. The day was pleasantly warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and open spaces. As they left the town behind, the landscape opened up into rolling grasslands dotted with stands of cottonwood trees and the occasional rocky outcropping. "It's beautiful," Pearl breathed, taking in the vastness of the landscape. "Different from the East, but beautiful in its own way." Flynn glanced at her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Most Easterners find it too empty, too wild." "I find it freeing," Pearl admitted. "In Boston, there were always buildings, always people. You couldn't ever truly be alone with your thoughts." "And is that what you want?" To be alone with your thoughts, Pearl considered the question. "Sometimes. After my parents died last winter, the city felt suffocating. Everyone knew us. Everyone had opinions about what I should do with my life." She looked at him directly. "Is that why you live out here?" To be alone with your thoughts. Flynn was quiet for so long that Pearl thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Partly. My father loved this land, said it spoke to him in a way people never could. I didn't understand what he meant until after he was gone. And now I hear it too. The whisper of the grass, the rhythm of the seasons, the honesty of it all." Flynn looked embarrassed suddenly. "Sorry, that probably sounds foolish." "Not at all," Pearl said softly. "I think it sounds like home." They rode in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own reflections. Pearl found herself stealing glances at Flynn's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he squinted against the sun. "Tell me about your brother," she said eventually, curious about the family she would be meeting. Flynn's expression softened. "Finn's 4 years younger than me, 25 now. He has more charm in his little finger than I have in my whole body, according to most folks. He married Sarah 2 years ago. She was the school teacher in Redemption Springs until they started their family. They have children. A little boy, Samuel, just turned 1. Pride was evident in Flynn's voice. Smart as a whip, according to Finn, though I suspect all fathers think that about their sons. And what about you? Pearl asked before she could stop herself. Have you never thought of starting a family of your own? Flynn's hands tightened on the reins. I almost did once. The pain in those 4 words told Pearl not to press further. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about the cattle operation and the challenges of ranching in this part of the territory. Flynn seemed grateful for the shift and spoke at length about his herd of Herefords, the struggle against drought and harsh winters, and his hopes for expanding the ranch's operations. Pearl found herself genuinely interested, asking questions that showed she was following his explanations. You know a fair bit about business for a lady, Flynn observed. My father was a merchant, Pearl explained. He believed his daughters should understand finances as well as any son. My sister married a banker and moved to New York, but I stayed to help with the family store until... She trailed off, the grief still fresh. Until you lost them, Flynn finished gently. Pearl nodded. The influenza took them both within days of each other. After settling their affairs, there was little left, not enough to maintain our home or the store. So you answered Jenkins' advertisement. One of several I wrote to, Pearl admitted. His response seemed the most promising. He wrote about wanting a partner, someone to help build a future with. She laughed without humor. Clearly, his letters painted quite a different picture than the reality. Flynn's jaw tightened. Jenkins has done this before. Lures women out here with promises, then humiliates them for sport. Mrs. Holloway mentioned that. Why does no one stop him? The law's thin out here. And technically, he hasn't broken any laws. He offers marriage, and if the women refuse after his joke, he considers it their choice. Flynn looked at her. You're the first one who stayed in town after refusing him. I have nowhere else to go, Pearl said simply. And I won't be run off by a bully like Harold Jenkins. Flynn's expression softened into something like admiration. No, I don't believe you would be. They crested a small rise and Flynn pointed ahead. There it is, Fraser Ranch. Pearl followed his gesture and saw a collection of buildings nestled in a small valley. A 2-story farmhouse with a wide porch stood as the centerpiece, surrounded by a barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. In the distance, cattle grazed on the rolling grassland. It's lovely, Pearl said sincerely. Flynn's chest swelled slightly with pride. It's not grand, but it's good land. My father chose well. As they approached, Pearl could see a woman emerge from the house, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She waved enthusiastically when she spotted the wagon. That's Sarah, Flynn explained. I told you she was eager to meet you. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house and Flynn jumped down to help Pearl descend. Before her feet even touched the ground, Sarah Fraser was hurrying toward them, a wide smile on her pretty face. You must be Miss Bennett. I'm Sarah Fraser, Finn's wife. She was a petite woman with warm brown eyes and chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun. Welcome to Fraser Ranch. We're so pleased you could come. Pearl found herself immediately drawn to Sarah's genuine warmth. Please call me Pearl, and thank you for having me. Flynn told us what happened in town, Sarah said, lowering her voice slightly. That Harold Jenkins is a disgrace. I taught his nephew in school, and the apple didn't fall far from the tree, let me tell you. Sarah, Flynn admonished gently, perhaps we could get Miss Bennett settled before you share all the town gossip, Sarah laughed. Of course. Come inside, Pearl. I've prepared the guest room for you and there's fresh coffee on the stove. As Sarah led her into the house, Pearl glanced back to see Flynn watching them, an unreadable expression on his face. When he caught her looking, he quickly turned away, busying himself with the horses. The interior of the Fraser home was surprisingly comfortable. The furniture was solid and well made, if not fancy, and everything was clean and orderly. Family photographs adorned the walls, and a vase of wildflowers sat on the dining table. "Flynn didn't mention how lovely your home is," Pearl said as Sarah showed her to a small but comfortable guest room on the second floor. "It's come a long way since I arrived," Sarah confided. "Bachelor living, you know. Finn and Flynn kept the place clean enough, but it needed a woman's touch." She smoothed the quilt on the bed. "I'll let you freshen up. The washroom is just down the hall and there's fresh water in the pitcher. Come down when you're ready." Left alone, Pearl unpinned her hat and sat on the edge of the bed. Through the window, she could see Flynn leading the horses to the barn, his movements sure and efficient. There was something compelling about his quiet confidence, so different from the brash cowboys she'd encountered in town. Pearl shook her head, bemused by the direction of her thoughts. She had come west to marry, yes, but after the disaster with Jenkins, she should be more cautious, not daydreaming about a man she barely knew. Still, as she washed her face and tidied her hair, she couldn't help but wonder if fate had led her to this ranch for a reason. Downstairs, she found Sarah in the kitchen, kneading bread dough while keeping an eye on a toddler playing with wooden blocks on a blanket nearby. "And this must be Samuel," Pearl said, kneeling to greet the child. "Yes, our little whirlwind," Sarah laughed as the boy abandoned his blocks to investigate the newcomer. "He's just started walking and nothing in the house is safe anymore." Pearl offered the child a finger which he grasped with a chubby hand. "He's beautiful. Thank you." Sarah's face softened as she watched her son. "We're hoping to give him a sister or brother soon." She blushed. "Listen to me, talking so freely to someone I've just met. Flynn said you were easy to talk to. Did he?" Pearl couldn't help the pleased flutter in her chest at the thought that Flynn had spoken about her. "Oh yes, Flynn doesn't say much, but when he does, it's worth listening to." Sarah shaped the dough into a loaf and set it aside to rise. "He was quite impressed with how you handled yourself after that awful business at the saloon." Before Pearl could respond, the door opened, and two men entered Flynn, followed by a slightly shorter man who bore a striking resemblance to him, though with a more open expression. "You must be Miss Bennett," the second man said, crossing the room to greet her. "I'm Flynn Fraser. Welcome to our home." "Thank you for having me," Pearl replied, noting the same blue eyes as Flynn's, though Finn's crinkled more readily with his smile. "Nonsense. It's a pleasure to have another lady around. Sarah's been outnumbered far too long." "And you must be Samuel," Pearl said to the toddler, who had attached himself to his father's leg. Finn scooped up his son with practiced ease. "This little rascal is indeed Samuel Fraser, future rancher extraordinaire, if his uncle has anything to say about it." Flynn, who had been hanging his hat by the door, shot his brother an unreadable look. "The boy can be whatever he wants to be." "And Flynn wants him to want to be a rancher," Finn Stage whispered to Pearl, earning a chuckle from Sarah and a raised eyebrow from his brother. Pearl observed the easy camaraderie between the brothers with a pang of envy. It reminded her of the relationship she'd once shared with her sister before distance and marriage had created a gulf between them. "Finn, stop teasing and show Flynn what arrived while he was in town," Sarah said, wiping her hands on her apron. Finn's expression grew more serious. "Right. Flynn, we got a letter from the bank in Denver. They've agreed to extend the loan for the new breeding stock, but they're asking for additional collateral." Flynn's jaw tightened. "We don't have additional collateral. Everything we own is already tied up in this place." I know. That's why I thought we might approach Cooper about partnering on the venture. He's mentioned before that he'd be interested in diversifying his investments. We'll discuss it later, Flynn said with a glance toward Pearl, clearly uncomfortable having business matters aired in front of her. Sensing the tension, Sarah stepped in. Dinner won't be ready for another hour. Why don't you show Pearl around the ranch, Flynn? I'm sure she'd like to see more than just the inside of the house. Flynn hesitated, then nodded. If you'd like to, Miss Bennett. I'd love to, Pearl said, genuinely interested in seeing more of the operation. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the ranch. Flynn led Pearl first to the barn, where several horses nickered in greeting from their stalls. This is Thunder, Flynn said, stopping before a magnificent black stallion. He's our best stud. Finn's been breeding horses as a sideline to the cattle operation. Pearl approached the stall cautiously. The horse eyed her with interest before stretching his neck to sniff her outstretched hand. He's beautiful, she breathed, admiring the animal's glossy coat and powerful build. He knows it too, Flynn said with a hint of a smile. Vainest horse I've ever seen. As if to prove the point, Thunder tossed his mane and pranced slightly in his stall, earning a laugh from Pearl. They continued the tour, with Flynn showing her the corrals where young colts frolicked, the smithy where tools were repaired, and finally, a small rise overlooking the pastures where the cattle grazed. My father's favorite spot, Flynn said as they stood side by side, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. He said you could see the whole world from here. I can understand why he felt that way, Pearl said softly. There's something powerful about this view, like you can see forever. Flynn glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. That's exactly what he used to say. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as a hawk circled lazily overhead. Pearl was acutely aware of Flynn's presence beside her, the solid warmth of him, the subtle scent of leather and horses, and something uniquely him. May I ask you something, Miss Bennett? Pearl, please. And yes, of course. Flynn seemed to choose his words carefully. What will you do now? With Jenkins' offer refused, Pearl considered the question. I'll continue working at the general store for now, save my wages. Perhaps eventually I could open a small business of my own. You don't intend to return east? No. The certainty in her voice surprised even her. There's nothing for me there anymore. And despite my rather unfortunate introduction to it, I find I like the West. There's a freedom here that I never felt in Boston. Flynn nodded as if her answer confirmed something for him. It suits you. The West, you have the strength for it. Coming from Flynn Fraser, Pearl suspected that was high praise indeed. Thank you. She turned to face him fully. May I ask you something in return? Fair's fair, he agreed, though a wariness entered his eyes. At the store, Jenkins said something about you being too busy brooding over your past to build a future. What did he mean by that? Flynn's expression shuddered, and for a moment, Pearl thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, looking out over the land rather than at her. 3 years ago, I was engaged to be married. Catherine was the daughter of a rancher from the next county. We'd known each other since we were children. His voice was flat, as if he were reciting facts rather than sharing a personal story. 2 weeks before the wedding, there was an incident in town. Some drovers passing through got drunk, started making trouble. I stepped in, much like I did with you at the saloon. He paused, and Pearl could sense there was more to the story, something painful. One of them pulled a gun. I was faster. Flynn's hand unconsciously moved to his side, where Pearl now realized his gun would normally rest. The man lived, but Catherine couldn't reconcile herself to being married to someone who had shot another human being, even in self-defense. She broke off the engagement and married a shopkeeper in Denver 6 months later. "I'm sorry," Pearl said softly, understanding now the shadow that sometimes crossed his face. Flynn shrugged, a gesture that failed to conceal the hurt still evident in his eyes. "It was for the best. She wanted a different life than I could offer. Still, it must have been painful." "It was." Flynn finally looked at her. "Jenkins thinks I'm still pining for her, that I've sworn off women altogether. The truth is simpler. I've been busy keeping this ranch afloat. Between the drought 2 years ago and cattle prices dropping, it's been a struggle." Pearl felt a surge of admiration for this man who shouldered such responsibilities without complaint. "Your brother is fortunate to have you." Flynn's expression softened. "We're fortunate to have each other. After our parents died, it would have been easy to sell the ranch, go our separate ways, but this land is in our blood. We couldn't abandon it." The dinner bell rang in the distance, interrupting the moment. "We should head back," Flynn said, offering his arm to Pearl. "Sarah doesn't appreciate her meals getting cold." As they walked back toward the house, Pearl felt a growing warmth that had nothing to do with the setting sun. There was something about Flynn Fraser that called to her his quiet strength, his sense of responsibility, the glimpses of tenderness she'd witnessed with his nephew. For the first time since her parents' deaths, Pearl felt the stirrings of hope for a future that might include not just security, but also happiness. Dinner at the Fraser Ranch was a revelation to Pearl. After months of travel, eating in stage-coach stops and boarding houses, the simple but abundant meal Sarah prepared was nothing short of glorious. Roast chicken, fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden, warm bread, and apple pie for dessert, all served with genuine hospitality that made Pearl feel welcome. The conversation flowed easily, with Finn regaling them with stories about the town and its inhabitants. Pearl learned that the Fraser brothers were well respected in the area, known for their fair dealings and hard work. Finn had a natural gift for storytelling, his animated expressions and occasional impression of a neighbor drawing laughter from everyone, even the usually reserved Flynn. And then Mrs. Abernathy said, "Well, I never," and stormed out of the church social, pie still dripping from her hat. Finn concluded one tale, causing Sarah to giggle uncontrollably. "Finn, you're terrible," she chided her husband affectionately. "Mrs. Abernathy is a perfectly nice woman, who happens to have the sharpest tongue west of the Mississippi," Finn countered with a wink at Pearl. Flynn, who had been quietly enjoying his brother's storytelling, spoke up. "Miss Bennett doesn't need to hear about every piece of town gossip, Finn." "On the contrary," Pearl said, "I find it helpful to learn about the community I've joined. Mrs. Abernathy sounds like someone I should be careful not to cross." "Smart woman," Finn approved. "Flynn, you found yourself a clever one." Flynn's face reddened slightly. "Miss Bennett is her own woman, Finn. I didn't find her." Pearl felt her own cheeks warm at the implication. "Mr. Fraser Flynn was kind enough to intervene when I found myself in an unfortunate situation. That's all." "Of course," Finn agreed, though the knowing glance he exchanged with his wife suggested he thought otherwise. To Pearl's relief, Sarah changed the subject, asking about Pearl's life in Boston and her journey west. Pearl found herself sharing more than she'd intended: her childhood in a merchant's home, her education at a ladies' seminary, her brief engagement to a banker's son that ended when she insisted on helping in her father's store rather than becoming a society wife. "You were engaged before?" Flynn asked, speaking up for the first time in a while. "Briefly," Pearl confirmed. "Richard Thornton was a suitable match on paper: good family, stable profession, appropriate age. But he wanted a wife who would focus solely on maintaining a home and advancing his social position." "And that wasn't what you wanted," Flynn observed. "No," Pearl smiled ruefully. I enjoyed working in my father's store. I like using my mind, being useful. Richard couldn't understand that. His loss, Finn declared, raising his coffee cup in a small toast to Pearl. After dinner, Sarah insisted that Pearl relax while she and Finn cleaned up. Flynn excused himself to check on a mare that was close to foaling, leaving Pearl to explore the small parlor. A bookshelf caught her attention, and she was surprised to find it well stocked with volumes ranging from practical manuals on animal husbandry to classics like Shakespeare and Dickens. She was examining a well-worn copy of David Copperfield when Flynn returned. "You found my guilty pleasure," he said from the doorway, startling her. "You enjoy Dickens?" Flynn nodded, crossing to stand beside her at the bookshelf. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She insisted we have proper educations even out here." "This copy looks well read," Pearl observed, noting the creased spine and dog-eared pages. It was her favorite. Flynn carefully took the book from her, his fingers brushing against hers in a touch that sent an unexpected warmth through Pearl's hand. She used to read it aloud during the long winter evenings. Pearl could picture it, a younger Flynn and Finn gathered around their mother, listening to Dickens' words while snow piled up outside. "You miss her?" It wasn't a question, but Flynn answered anyway. "Every day." She had a way of making this house feel like more than just shelter. She made it a home. "Sarah seems to be carrying on that tradition," Pearl observed. Flynn's expression softened. "She's been good for Finn and for this place. Brought life back to it after years of just us two bachelors rattling around." "And what about you?" The question slipped out before Pearl could stop it. "Don't you want that kind of home for yourself?" Flynn's eyes met hers, and Pearl felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared loneliness. "I did once," he said quietly. "Now I'm not sure what I want anymore." The honesty of his admission touched Pearl deeply. "I understand that feeling. Coming west was supposed to give me a new start, a clear path forward. Instead, I find myself more uncertain than ever." "Do you regret it, coming west?" Pearl considered the question carefully. "No, despite everything, no. There's something about this place, the openness, the possibility of it, that speaks to me." Flynn nodded as if her answer made perfect sense to him. "The land gets in your blood." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the distant murmur of Finn and Sarah's voices from the kitchen. "Would you like to see the foal?" Flynn asked suddenly. The mare delivered safely. Pearl's face lit up. "I'd love to." Flynn led her back to the barn, lantern in hand. The soft glow illuminated the stalls where most of the horses were already settled for the night. At the far end, Flynn stopped before a larger stall where a chestnut mare stood protectively over a tiny, spindly-legged foal. "She delivered about an hour ago," Flynn explained, keeping his voice low. "First-time mother, but she's doing well." The foal was still damp, its coat dark with moisture, but it had already found its feet and was nuzzling against its mother's side, searching for milk. "Oh," Pearl breathed, enchanted by the sight. "He's beautiful." Flynn corrected with a small smile. "It's a filly. A good one from the looks of her conformation." Pearl watched as the foal found what she was looking for and began to nurse, her tiny tail swishing with contentment. "What will you call her?" she asked. Flynn considered the question. "Traditionally, Finn names the horses and I name the cattle, but perhaps you'd like to name this one." Pearl looked at him in surprise. "Me, but I'm just a visitor. Consider it a thank you for coming out to the ranch." "You've made Sarah's week, giving her another woman to talk to." "Only Sarah's week?" Pearl asked, a teasing note entering her voice without her conscious permission. Flynn's eyes caught hers over the lantern's glow. "No," he admitted softly. "Not only Sarah's." Pearl's breath caught at the unexpected admission. To cover her confusion, she turned back to the foal. "Dawn," she said after a moment, "because she's a new beginning." Flynn nodded slowly. "Dawn it is." Back at the house, Sarah had prepared hot chocolate, and the four adults sat around the fireplace, enjoying the sweet drink while little Samuel slept in a cradle nearby. The conversation was easy, comfortable in a way Pearl hadn't experienced since before her parents' deaths. "Will you play something for us, Flynn?" Sarah asked, gesturing to a piano in the corner that Pearl hadn't noticed before. Flynn looked embarrassed. "I'm sure Miss Bennett doesn't want to hear my poor attempts at music." "On the contrary," Pearl said, "I'd love to hear you play." With obvious reluctance, Flynn moved to the piano and seated himself on the bench. For a moment, his hands hovered over the keys as if he were deciding what to play. Then his fingers descended, and the opening notes of a haunting melody filled the room. Pearl watched, transfixed, as Flynn Fraser was transformed by the music. The reserve that normally characterized his expression melted away as he played, replaced by a passionate intensity that took her breath away. His large, work-roughened hands moved with unexpected grace over the keys, drawing forth a melody that spoke of longing and hope. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of perfect silence before Flynn spoke. "Chopin," he identified the piece. "Flynn's favorite." "That was beautiful," Pearl said sincerely. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "Our mother insisted we both have lessons," Flynn explained, closing the piano lid. "Finn abandoned it as soon as she let him, but I found I enjoyed it." "Flynn's being modest," Sarah added. "He could have been a concert pianist if he'd been born somewhere other than the frontier." Flynn shook his head. "I play for my own enjoyment, nothing more." But Pearl noticed the pleased look that crossed his face at her admiration. Later, as Pearl prepared for bed in the guest room, she found herself replaying moments from the day Flynn's profile against the setting sun as they stood overlooking the ranch. The gentle way he'd handled the newborn foal, the surprising passion in his piano playing. Each revelation added a new layer to her understanding of this complex man who had come to her rescue in the saloon. She had come west expecting to marry a stranger. Instead, she had found herself stranded in a frontier town with no prospects and little money. Yet somehow, as she drifted off to sleep in the Fraser ranch house, Pearl couldn't help feeling that perhaps things were working out exactly as they should. Morning came with the crowing of roosters and the distant lowing of cattle. Pearl dressed quickly in her spare dress and made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and bacon to the kitchen. She found Flynn alone at the stove, turning strips of bacon in a cast-iron pan. "Good morning," she greeted him, suddenly self-conscious in her simple attire. Flynn looked up, and something in his expression made Pearl's heart skip a beat. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," she admitted. "There's something peaceful about this place." Flynn nodded, understanding in his eyes. Sarah and Finn took Samuel to check on the foal. "They'll be back shortly." He gestured to the stove. "I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage breakfast." "Let me help," Pearl offered, moving to his side. They worked together in companionable silence, Pearl mixing batter for flapjacks while Flynn finished the bacon and started eggs. There was an easy rhythm to their movements, as if they'd done this 100 times before. "You're good at this," Flynn observed as Pearl flipped a perfect flapjack. "Cooking, I mean. My mother insisted all her daughters learn to run a household properly, even if we were merchant class rather than farmers." Pearl smiled at the memory. "She said a woman should never be helpless, regardless of her station in life." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Pearl felt the familiar pang of grief, but it was softer now, tempered by time and the comfort of sharing the memory. "Your mother sounds similar, insisting on education and music lessons out here on the frontier. They would have liked each other, I think, Flynn said, and the simple statement created an unexpected connection between them, a bridge across their different backgrounds. By the time Finn, Sarah, and Samuel returned, breakfast was ready. The meal was filled with laughter and planning for the day, with Finn teasing his brother about burning the bacon, which he hadn't, and Sarah sharing news about the foal's progress. "She's already stronger this morning," Sarah reported. "Dawn is a perfect name for her, Pearl. She's definitely a new beginning." After breakfast, Flynn offered to show Pearl more of the ranch before taking her back to town. They rode out together, Pearl on a gentle mare named Daisy, Flynn on his own gelding, Scout. "Have you ridden much before?" Flynn asked as they set out. "A little," Pearl admitted. "My uncle had a farm outside Boston where we spent summers as children. Nothing like this, though." She gestured to the vast landscape surrounding them. Flynn led her along the creek that ran through the property, pointing out beaver dams and explaining how the water rights were crucial to the ranch's success. They rode past herds of cattle, with Flynn identifying different breeds and explaining his plans for improving the stock. "You really love this land, don't you?" Pearl observed as they paused atop a rise overlooking the valley. "It's part of me," Flynn said simply. "When my father first brought us here, I was 10 years old. The house was half built, the barn was just a foundation, and all I could see was wilderness. But he saw possibility. And now you see it too." Flynn nodded, his gaze sweeping over the ranch. "Every year it gets better, more established. The trees we planted are taller, the herds are stronger. It's a good feeling building something that will last." "Something to pass on to the next generation," Pearl said, thinking of little Samuel. "Yes, though Finn insists the boy will be a horse breeder, not a cattle rancher." Flynn smiled fondly. "We'll see. Maybe he'll surprise us all and become a doctor or a lawyer." "Or a concert pianist like his uncle," Pearl suggested with a small smile. Flynn laughed, a rich sound that Pearl realized she'd heard too rarely. "God help us all if that's the case." As they turned their horses back toward the ranch house, Pearl found herself wishing they could ride on forever, postponing the moment when she would have to return to town and the uncertain future that awaited her there. All too soon, it was time to leave. Sarah hugged Pearl warmly, extracting a promise that she would visit again soon. "Perhaps next Sunday," Sarah suggested. "We could make it a regular thing." "I'd like that very much," Pearl agreed, touched by the genuine invitation. Finn shook her hand with a wink. "Don't be a stranger, Miss Bennett. It's not often we meet someone who can keep up with Flynn's brooding." "I don't brood," Flynn protested, though without heat. "You absolutely do," Finn countered good-naturedly. "But less so when Miss Bennett is around, I've noticed." Flynn ignored his brother's teasing and helped Pearl into the wagon. The ride back to town was quieter than the journey out had been, as if both were reluctant to break the spell of the weekend with talk of returning to their separate lives. As the buildings of Redemption Springs came into view, Flynn finally spoke. "I meant what I said about checking on you. I'll be in town again on Wednesday for the cattle auction." "I'll be fine," Pearl assured him, though secretly pleased at his concern. "Mrs. Holloway runs a tight ship, and Mr. Cooper has been very kind." Flynn nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Jenkins isn't the type to take rejection well. If he bothers you, send word to the ranch immediately." "I can handle Harold Jenkins," Pearl said with more confidence than she felt. "But thank you for your concern." The wagon rolled to a stop in front of Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. Flynn jumped down and came around to help Pearl descend, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "Thank you for inviting me to your home," Pearl said, suddenly shy. "It was a lovely weekend." "Thank you for coming," Flynn replied, holding her gaze longer than strictly necessary. It was. Nice having you there. From Flynn Fraser, Pearl suspected that was high praise indeed. Mrs. Holloway appeared at the door, breaking the moment. There you are, dear. How was your visit to the Fraser ranch? Wonderful, Pearl answered honestly, turning to include the older woman in the conversation. Sarah and Finn were very welcoming. They're good people, the Frasers, Mrs. Holloway agreed, her sharp eyes moving between Pearl and Flynn with obvious speculation. Flynn, will you stay for supper? Thank you, madam, but I should get back to the ranch before dark. Flynn tipped his hat to both women. Miss Bennett, Mrs. Holloway. Pearl watched as he climbed back into the wagon, an inexplicable sense of loss washing over her as he drove away. It was foolish, she knew. She had known the man for barely a week, yet something about Flynn Fraser called to her in a way no one ever had before. Well, Mrs. Holloway said with a knowing smile, it seems you made quite an impression on our Flynn. I don't know what you mean, Pearl protested weakly. Mrs. Holloway just chuckled. Of course you don't, dear. Come inside now. I want to hear all about your visit to the ranch, and you can tell me why Flynn Fraser is looking at you like a man who's just discovered water in the desert. The days that followed fell into a pattern for Pearl. She worked at Cooper's General Store during the day, learning the business and becoming acquainted with the townspeople. In the evenings, she helped Mrs. Holloway with chores around the boarding house in exchange for reduced rent. On Sundays, Flynn would arrive to take her to the ranch for dinner with his family, a tradition that quickly became the highlight of Pearl's week. As June gave way to July, Pearl found herself increasingly settled in Redemption Springs. The initial curiosity about her arrival as a mail-order bride had largely faded, replaced by acceptance as she became a familiar face at the store and at church services. Even Harold Jenkins had kept his distance, apparently having found another woman to correspond with back east. One Wednesday afternoon, Pearl was arranging a new shipment of fabric when the store bell jangled. Looking up, she smiled at the sight of Flynn, hat in hand, looking somewhat out of place among the bolts of calico and gingham. Flynn, I wasn't expecting you until Sunday. I had business in town, he explained. Thought I'd stop by and see how you were doing. In truth, Flynn had been finding more and more reasons to come to town over the past weeks. What had once been monthly trips for supplies had become weekly visits, much to Finn's amusement. I'm well, thank you. Pearl set aside the fabric she'd been holding. How are things at the ranch? Good. The new bull arrived yesterday, cost a small fortune, but he should improve the herd considerably. And Dawn, how is she growing? A smile softened Flynn's features. Like a weed. She follows Thunder around the paddock like a shadow. Finn says she'll make a fine cutting horse when she's grown. Pearl had come to love these conversations with Flynn, the easy way he shared details of ranch life, his quiet pride in the work he did. Over the weeks, she'd learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, to understand what lay beneath his often taciturn exterior. Mr. Cooper mentioned that you'd ordered some books, Flynn said, changing the subject. I came to collect them if they've arrived. They have indeed. Pearl moved to a shelf behind the counter. I set them aside for you yesterday. She handed over a package wrapped in brown paper. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, sending a now familiar warmth up Pearl's arm. These small touches had become more frequent between them, Flynn's hand at her elbow as they walked, their fingers meeting as they passed the salt at Sunday dinner, his palm against her back as he helped her into the wagon. Each touch lingered a little longer than necessary, each glance held a beat too long to be merely friendly. Yet neither had spoken of the growing attraction between them. Thank you. Flynn tucked the package under his arm. I was wondering if you might join me for supper at the hotel restaurant tonight. They serve a decent steak." Pearl blinked in surprise. In all their meetings, they had never dined alone together in public. "I'd like that," she said, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "I'll call for you at the boarding house at 6 if that suits." "It does." Flynn nodded, seeming pleased despite his reserved expression. "Until then, Miss Bennett." "Pearl," she corrected gently. "After all this time, surely you can call me Pearl." A small smile curved his lips. "Pearl," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name. "Until tonight, Pearl." After he left, Pearl found it difficult to concentrate on her work. The prospect of dining alone with Flynn, something that felt very much like a proper courtship, filled her with both excitement and trepidation. That evening, Pearl took unusual care with her appearance, wearing her best dress, a blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranging her hair in a becoming style. Mrs. Holloway watched her preparations with knowing eyes, but mercifully kept her comments to herself. At precisely 6 o'clock, Flynn arrived at the boarding house. He too had made an effort, wearing a clean shirt and string tie with his usual denim pants and boots. His hair was damp from a recent washing, and he'd clearly shaved for the occasion. "You look lovely," he said simply when Pearl appeared in the parlor. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." Flynn offered his arm, and together they walked the short distance to the Redemption Springs Hotel. The restaurant was the finest establishment in town, which wasn't saying much, but it was clean and well-maintained, with tablecloths and proper silverware. Heads turned as they entered, and Pearl could almost hear the gossip starting. Flynn Fraser, dining in public with the mail-order bride who'd refused Harold Jenkins. It would be all over town by morning. If Flynn noticed the attention, he gave no sign of it. He simply escorted Pearl to a table and held her chair with the natural courtesy that always surprised her, given his frontier upbringing. "I hope this is acceptable," he said as they settled across from each other. "It's not Boston, but it's perfect," Pearl interrupted gently. "Truly." Their conversation over dinner flowed easily, as it always did when they were together. Flynn told her about the new breeding program he was implementing, while Pearl shared stories about the customers at Cooper's store. They discovered a shared love of Charles Dickens and debated the merits of Great Expectations versus David Copperfield. "I never would have taken you for a literary man when I first met you," Pearl admitted as they lingered over coffee and apple pie. "No," Flynn looked amused. "What did you take me for?" Pearl considered the question. "A hero from a dime novel, perhaps, the mysterious cowboy who rides into town and fights for justice." Flynn actually laughed at that. "Hardly. I'm just a rancher trying to keep his herd healthy and his family fed." "And yet you did ride to my rescue in a manner of speaking." Flynn's expression grew more serious. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," Pearl reminded him. "You did." Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, that what they were building went beyond friendship. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of the hotel owner with their bill. Flynn paid promptly, then offered Pearl his arm once more for the walk back to the boarding house. The summer evening was warm and pleasant, with a hint of sage on the breeze. They walked slowly, neither in a hurry for the evening to end. "I've been meaning to ask you," Flynn said as they approached Mrs. Holloway's. "The town's planning a social for Independence Day next week. There'll be a picnic, dancing, fireworks after dark. I thought perhaps. That is, if you'd like to attend, I'd be honored to escort you." The formal invitation, delivered with such careful hesitation, touched Pearl deeply. "I'd be delighted, Flynn." They had reached the boarding house steps. Flynn turned to face her, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable in the glow of the porch lantern. "Pearl, I know you came west expecting something very different than what you found," he began, his voice low. "And I know your experience with Jenkins was difficult." "Flynn," he held up a hand gently. "Please let me finish. What I'm trying to say, not very well, is that I've come to care for you a great deal over these past weeks. More than I thought possible after Catherine." Pearl's heart raced at the admission. "I've come to care for you too," she whispered. Flynn took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "I'm not a wealthy man," he continued. "The ranch makes a decent living, but it's hard work with no guarantees. I can't offer the kind of life you might have had in Boston." "I don't want that life," Pearl said with quiet certainty. "I never did." Hope flickered in Flynn's eyes. "I'd like to call on you properly if you'll allow it, to court you with intention." The old-fashioned phrasing made Pearl smile. "I'd like that very much." Flynn's smile in return was like the sunrise, rare and breathtaking in its full glory. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and brushed his lips against hers in a gentle, chaste kiss. It lasted only a moment, but Pearl felt it down to her toes, a promise, a beginning. "Good night, Pearl," Flynn murmured as he straightened. "Good night, Flynn." As Pearl watched him walk away, her fingers touched her lips where she could still feel the warmth of his kiss. She had come west seeking security through marriage to a stranger. Instead, she had found something infinitely more precious, the possibility of love with a man she was coming to know and respect more each day. The week leading up to Independence Day passed in a blur of anticipation for Pearl. Flynn came to town twice more, taking her for walks along the creek, and on one memorable evening, to a small traveling theater company's performance of Romeo and Juliet in the town hall. Word of their courtship spread quickly through Redemption Springs. Most reactions were positive. Flynn was well respected, and Pearl had made a good impression during her time at Cooper's store. A few people expressed surprise that the reserved rancher had finally shown interest in someone after the Catherine debacle, but even they seemed to approve of the match. Only Harold Jenkins seemed displeased, glowering at them from across the street when they passed. Flynn had warned Pearl to keep her distance from the man, explaining that Jenkins had a mean streak that grew worse when he drank. "He's not dangerous, exactly," Flynn had said, "but he's the type to hold a grudge, and he may see my interest in you as some sort of personal affront." Pearl had promised to be careful, though she refused to let Jenkins' pettiness cast a shadow over her happiness. The morning of July 4th dawned bright and clear, promising perfect weather for the town's celebration. Pearl wore a new dress she had splurged on, a pretty green calico with white trim that Sarah had helped her alter to fit perfectly. Flynn arrived at the boarding house promptly at 10, looking handsome in his Sunday best. The admiration in his eyes when he saw Pearl made the extravagance of the new dress entirely worthwhile. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering her a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Thank you." Pearl tucked one of the blossoms into her hair and kept the rest in hand, as Flynn escorted her to the town square where the festivities were already underway. The celebration was everything a small frontier town could muster. Bunting decorated the main buildings, and tables groaned under the weight of potluck offerings. A makeshift bandstand had been erected in the center of the square, where local musicians were tuning up for later dancing. Pearl and Flynn made the rounds, greeting neighbors and friends. Pearl was touched by how easily Flynn introduced her to those she hadn't yet met, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. They had just finished sampling Mrs. Cooper's renowned apple cider when Sarah hurried over to them, little Samuel toddling at her side. "There you are," she exclaimed, hugging Pearl warmly. I was beginning to think you two were avoiding us." "Just making the rounds," Flynn assured his sister-in-law, bending down to scoop up his nephew. "How's my favorite rancher in training?" Samuel squealed with delight as Flynn swung him up onto his shoulders. Pearl watched them with a soft smile, thinking how natural Flynn looked with a child and how much she'd like to see him with children of his own someday. Their children. The thought startled her with its clarity and certainty. "Pearl, are you all right?" Sarah asked, noticing her distraction. "Yes, of course." Pearl shook off the momentary reverie. "Just enjoying the day." Sarah's knowing smile suggested she might have guessed the direction of Pearl's thoughts, but she tactfully changed the subject. "The dancing will start soon. Has my brooding brother-in-law warned you about his 2 left feet yet?" Flynn, who had returned with Samuel, frowned at Sarah. "I dance just fine." "If by fine you mean you haven't actually trampled anyone yet, then yes, I suppose you do," Sarah teased. "Don't listen to her," Flynn told Pearl with mock seriousness. "She's been trying to embarrass me since she married my brother." "Only because you make it so easy," Sarah retorted affectionately before taking Samuel from him. "Come on, little one. Let's find your daddy before these two abandon us again." As the afternoon progressed, Pearl found herself thoroughly enjoying the small town celebration. She participated in a ladies' sack race, coming in second, cheered for Flynn in the horseshoe tournament, which he won handily, and sampled more home cooking than she'd ever seen in one place. But the highlight came as the sun began to set, and the band struck up a lively tune for dancing. Flynn led her to the cleared area serving as a dance floor and took her in his arms with more grace than Sarah's teasing had led her to expect. "You dance very well," Pearl observed as they moved together in perfect rhythm. "Don't sound so surprised," Flynn said with a rare grin. "My mother insisted we learn, said no son of hers was going to shame her at social functions by clomping around like a draft horse." Pearl laughed, delighted by this glimpse into Flynn's childhood. "She sounds wonderful." She was. Flynn's eyes were warm with memory. "She would have liked you very much." They danced through several songs, alternating between lively reels and slower waltzes. During one such waltz, Flynn held her closer than propriety strictly allowed, his cheek nearly touching her hair as they moved together beneath the paper lantern strung above the square. "I could get used to this," he murmured, his voice for her ears alone. "Dancing." Pearl asked, though she suspected he meant something more, "Being with you, seeing you smile, holding you like this." Flynn's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "It feels right, Pearl." Her heart swelled with emotion. "It does feel right," she agreed softly. The moment was interrupted by a commotion near the refreshment table. Breaking apart, they turned to see Harold Jenkins, clearly drunk, arguing loudly with Mr. Cooper. "I said I want another drink," Jenkins slurred, jabbing a finger at the merchant's chest. "And I said you've had enough, Harold," Cooper replied firmly. "Go home and sleep it off." Jenkins swayed on his feet, his bleary gaze sweeping the crowd until it landed on Pearl and Flynn. His face darkened with anger. "Well, if it ain't the mail-order bride and her champion," he sneered. "Think you're better than the rest of us, don't you, Fraser?" Flynn stepped slightly in front of Pearl, his stance protective. "Go home, Jenkins. This isn't the time or place." "Not the time or place," Jenkins mimicked in a high voice. "Listen to him putting on airs. You may have fooled everyone else with your high and mighty act, but I know what you really are, just a dirt farmer with delusions of grandeur." Pearl felt Flynn tense beside her, but was impressed when he kept his voice level. "You're drunk, Jenkins. Don't say something you'll regret when you're sober." Jenkins laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Regret? The only thing I regret is not showing Miss High and Mighty Bennett what a real man is like before she got her hooks into you." Finn appeared at Flynn's side, his usual good humor replaced by a cold anger. "That's enough, Jenkins. Apologize to Miss Bennett and be on your way." "I ain't apologizing to no fancy Eastern lady who thinks she's too good for honest Harold Jenkins, but spreads her skirts for the first cowboy who," he never finished the sentence. Flynn's fist connected with Jenkins' jaw, sending the drunken man sprawling in the dirt. The crowd gasped, then fell silent as Flynn stood over the fallen man, his fists still clenched at his sides. "Get up and apologize to the lady," Flynn said, his voice dangerously quiet. Jenkins spat blood onto the ground. "Make me." "Flynn, don't," Pearl pleaded, placing a restraining hand on his arm. "He's not worth it." For a moment she thought Flynn wouldn't listen, that his anger would override his good sense. Then he exhaled slowly and stepped back. "You're right," he told Pearl. "He's not worth it." The town sheriff, who had been watching from nearby, stepped forward. "All right, that's enough excitement for one night. Jenkins, I'm taking you to cool off in a cell until you're sober." As the sheriff hauled Jenkins to his feet, the man continued to hurl insults at Flynn and Pearl, his words slurring together into barely coherent threats. "I'll deal with this," Finn told his brother. "Why don't you and Pearl go watch the fireworks? They'll be starting soon." Flynn hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave while Jenkins was still causing a scene. "Please," Pearl said softly. "I'd rather not have this ruin our evening." After a moment, Flynn nodded. "You're right, let's go." He led her away from the town square, down a path that followed the creek to a small bluff overlooking the settlement. They could still hear the music and laughter from the celebration, but it was peaceful here, with only the sound of crickets and the gentle gurgle of the water below. "I'm sorry about that," Flynn said as they settled on a flat rock with a clear view of the night sky. "Jenkins has always been a troublemaker, but tonight he crossed a line." "It's not your fault," Pearl assured him, sliding her hand into his. "Though I must admit, there was something rather satisfying about seeing him knocked into the dirt after what he said." Flynn's lips twitched with a suppressed smile. "Miss Bennett, I'm shocked. A proper lady shouldn't approve of violence." "Perhaps I'm not as proper as you thought," Pearl replied with a smile of her own. "I never thought you were proper," Flynn said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "I thought you were strong and kind and braver than anyone I've ever known." Pearl felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. "I'm not brave. Coming west was more desperation than courage." "It takes courage to leave everything familiar behind and start over in a strange place," Flynn argued. "Just as it took courage to stand up in that saloon when Jenkins was humiliating you." "I didn't stand up to him," Pearl reminded him. "You did that." Flynn squeezed her hand gently. "You were standing tall even before I stepped in." "That's what caught my attention that day, not just that Jenkins was being a bully, but that you weren't broken by it. You were holding on to your dignity with everything you had." Pearl had never thought of it that way. In her mind, she had been terrified and humiliated that day, not brave. "Is that why you fought for me? Because you thought I was brave?" Flynn considered the question, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand. "Partly, and partly because I couldn't stand to see Jenkins treating any woman that way, but mostly." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Mostly because something about you called to me. I can't explain it better than that." The first firework burst above them, illuminating Flynn's face in a flash of red and gold. In that brief, bright moment, Pearl saw the emotion in his eyes, a depth of feeling that matched her own growing attachment. "I'm glad you answered that call," she said softly. As more fireworks exploded overhead, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Flynn shifted to face Pearl directly. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, his voice barely audible over the booms and crackles. Pearl's heart skipped a beat. Yes. Flynn took both her hands in his. I know we haven't known each other long, not even 2 months, and I understand if you think it's too soon. Flynn, please, let me get this out before I lose my nerve. He took a deep breath. Pearl Bennett, these past weeks have been the happiest I can remember. You've brought light back into my life when I thought I'd be content with just getting by. I find myself thinking about you, constantly wondering what you're doing, hoping you're safe, planning what I want to show you next about the ranch and the land I love. Pearl felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the raw honesty in his words. I'm not a man who's good with flowery speeches, Flynn continued, but I know what I feel. I love you, Pearl. I think I started falling for you that first day in the saloon, and every day since has only made me more certain. Oh, Flynn, Pearl whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I love you too. The joy that spread across Flynn's face at her words was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. This was my mother's, he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small, perfect diamond. I'm asking you to be my wife, Pearl. Not because you need a husband or I need a wife, but because I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to share all the joys and sorrows that life brings together. Tears spilled freely down Pearl's cheeks now. Yes, she said, the word emerging half laughing, half sobbing. Yes, Flynn Fraser, I will marry you. Flynn's hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he drew her into his arms and kissed her properly, a deep, passionate kiss that expressed all the love and longing they'd been holding back. Above them, the fireworks reached their grand finale, filling the sky with cascading sparks of red, white, and blue. But Pearl barely noticed, lost as she was in Flynn's embrace and the promise of their future together. The engagement of Flynn Fraser and Pearl Bennett was the talk of Redemption Springs for weeks. Most of the town approved Flynn was a respected rancher, and Pearl had proven herself hardworking and kind during her time at the general store. A few raised eyebrows at the speed of the courtship, but as Mrs. Holloway pointed out to the town gossips, when you know, you know. And those two knew from the moment they laid eyes on each other. Pearl continued working at Cooper's store while preparations for the wedding progressed. Flynn rode into town more frequently than ever, often bringing small gifts, wildflowers, a book she'd mentioned wanting to read, once even a kitten from a litter born in the barn. The house needs a mouser, he'd claimed when he presented the tiny calico to Pearl, though his ears had reddened in that way she'd come to find endearing. Sarah took charge of the wedding plans, enlisting Pearl in discussions about everything from the ceremony to the wedding supper to which bedroom at the ranch would become theirs after the marriage. Flynn's is the largest, of course, Sarah said as they sorted through patterns for a wedding quilt, but it might need some feminine touches. That man has lived like a monk for too long. I don't want to displace him from his space, Pearl protested. Sarah waved away her concern. Trust me, he'll be happy to have you wherever you are. I've never seen my brooding brother-in-law so content. The truth of Sarah's words was evident whenever Flynn and Pearl were together. The reserved rancher smiled more, laughed more freely, and even participated in conversations that had nothing to do with cattle or horses. Finn teased his brother mercilessly about the transformation. If I'd known all it would take to make you human again was finding the right woman, I'd have imported a bride from Boston years ago, he joked during one Sunday dinner. Not just any woman, Flynn replied, his eyes finding Pearl's across the table. The right one. The only cloud on their happiness was Harold Jenkins, who had taken to glaring at them whenever they passed in town. Since the incident at the Independence Day celebration, He had kept his distance, but there was a malevolence in his gaze that made Pearl uneasy. Flynn assured her that Jenkins was all talk, but he was careful never to leave Pearl alone when the man was nearby, and he made sure she was safely escorted home each evening. As August ripened toward September, wedding plans took on a greater urgency. Flynn and Pearl had decided on a simple ceremony at the ranch on the first Saturday in October, when the cattle drive would be finished, and the aspens would be turning gold on the mountainsides. A new season, a new beginning, Flynn had said when they chose the date, echoing the name Pearl had given to the foal on her first visit to the ranch. Dawn was growing rapidly, already showing the conformation that Finn predicted would make her a fine cutting horse. Pearl had developed a special bond with the filly, bringing her treats whenever she visited and spending time just talking to the young horse. "I think she understands every word," Pearl told Flynn one Sunday as they watched Dawn frolic in the paddock. "Wouldn't surprise me," Flynn replied, his arm around Pearl's waist. "She was smart enough to recognize a kindred spirit in you." Pearl leaned into his embrace, still marveling at how natural it felt to be with him, how right. "Do you ever wonder how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't been in the saloon that day?" Flynn considered the question seriously. "I try not to dwell on might-have-beens, but yes, sometimes I think about how close we came to missing each other. If I'd been out checking fence lines instead of in town for supplies, if you'd arrived a day earlier or later. If I'd accepted Jenkins' offer despite his behavior," Pearl added softly. Flynn's arm tightened around her. "I'd like to think I would have found a way to meet you anyway. That we were meant to find each other somehow." The sentiment was uncharacteristically romantic coming from the practical rancher, and it touched Pearl deeply. "I believe that too," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "I came west looking for security, but I found so much more. I found home." Flynn bent to kiss her, a lingering, tender kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they finally broke apart, his blue eyes were dark with emotion. "3 more weeks," he murmured, resting his forehead against hers. "3 more weeks," Pearl agreed with a smile, "and then forever." The following Wednesday, Pearl was busy taking inventory at the store when the bell above the door jangled. Looking up with a smile, expecting to see a regular customer, she was startled to find Harold Jenkins swaying in the doorway. "Mr. Jenkins," she acknowledged coolly, glancing around the store. Unfortunately, Mr. Cooper had stepped out to the bank, leaving Pearl alone. "Can I help you with something?" Jenkins shambled forward, and Pearl could smell the whiskey on him from across the counter. "Thought you might like to know," he slurred. "Your precious Fraser isn't the saint you think he is." Pearl squared her shoulders, refusing to show fear. "Mr. Jenkins, I believe you've had too much to drink. Perhaps you should come back when you're sober." Jenkins ignored her suggestion. "Did he tell you about the man he killed 3 years ago right outside this very store?" "Flynn has never killed anyone," Pearl said firmly, though unease flickered through her. "If you're referring to the incident with the drovers, the man recovered completely." Jenkins gave an ugly laugh. "Is that what he told you?" "Well, Tom Harris might be surprised to hear that, considering he's been dead and buried these past 3 years. "You're lying," Pearl said, but doubt crept into her voice. "Ask anyone in town. Ask Cooper when he gets back. Fraser shot a man dead right on this street, and then wondered why his precious Catherine wouldn't marry a killer." Jenkins leaned over the counter, his breath foul. "Just thought the bride should know what kind of man she's marrying." With that parting shot, he turned and staggered out of the store, leaving Pearl shaken and confused. Flynn had told her about the incident, how he'd intervened when some drovers were causing trouble, how one had drawn on him, how he'd been forced to shoot in self-defense. But he'd said the man had lived, that it was Catherine's inability to reconcile herself to his actions that had ended their engagement. Had Flynn lied to her? Or was Jenkins merely trying to cause trouble? When Mr. Cooper returned, Pearl found herself unable to ask directly about the incident. Instead, she worked mechanically through the rest of the afternoon, her mind churning with questions and doubt. That evening, as she helped Mrs. Holloway prepare dinner, the older woman noticed her distraction. "Something on your mind, dear?" she asked, pausing in her chopping of carrots. Pearl hesitated, then decided that if anyone would give her a straight answer, it would be Mrs. Holloway. Today, Harold Jenkins came into the store. He was drunk, and he said that Flynn had killed a man 3 years ago, a drover named Tom Harris. Mrs. Holloway's expression turned serious. "Jenkins had no right to tell you that story. It should have come from Flynn." Pearl's heart sank. "Then it's true. Flynn did kill someone." Mrs. Holloway sighed and set down her knife. "Yes and no. It's not as simple as Jenkins made it sound, I'm sure." "Please, tell me what happened." The older woman gestured for Pearl to sit at the kitchen table. 3 years ago, a group of drovers came through town after delivering a herd to the railroad. They were in the saloon most of the day, getting rowdier as they drank. By evening, they were looking for trouble. Pearl listened intently as Mrs. Holloway continued. 2 of them started harassing a young woman, a girl, really, only 16, the blacksmith's daughter. Flynn happened to be in town and stepped in when things got physical. There was a scuffle, and one of the drovers, Tom Harris, pulled a gun. "And Flynn shot him," Pearl finished quietly. Mrs. Holloway nodded. "Flynn was faster on the draw, always has been. Shot Harris in the chest. The doctor did what he could, but the man died the next morning." She reached across the table to take Pearl's hand. "It was clear self-defense, dear. Every witness said the same. Harris would have shot Flynn if Flynn hadn't shot first." "But Flynn told me the man survived," Pearl said, confusion and hurt warring in her heart. "Did he?" Mrs. Holloway looked thoughtful. "Or did he say the incident resulted in Catherine breaking their engagement? Flynn's never been one to talk much about that time. It hit him hard, not just losing Catherine, but taking a life, even in self-defense." Pearl tried to recall Flynn's exact words when he'd told her about his broken engagement. He'd said the drover had pulled a gun, that he'd been faster, that Catherine couldn't reconcile herself to being married to someone who had shot another human being. But had he explicitly said the man had lived? "I need to speak with Flynn," Pearl decided, rising from her chair. "He'll be at the ranch," Mrs. Holloway pointed out. "It's getting dark." "Then I'll go first thing tomorrow." But Pearl found she couldn't wait until morning. After a sleepless night, she rose before dawn and left a note for Mrs. Holloway explaining where she'd gone. She borrowed a horse from the livery stable. The owner knew her well by now and was happy to oblige, and set out for the Fraser ranch just as the first light was breaking over the eastern horizon. The ride gave her time to think, to sort through her jumbled emotions. She wasn't angry that Flynn had killed a man in self-defense. She understood that the frontier sometimes demanded harsh choices. What hurt was the possibility that he had lied to her about it, or at least allowed her to believe something that wasn't true. Trust was everything to Pearl. After losing her parents, after Jenkins' betrayal, she had put her trust in Flynn Fraser. The thought that he might not have been completely honest with her opened a well of uncertainty that frightened her. As she approached the ranch, Pearl saw Flynn already at work in the corral, training a young horse. He looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, surprise and then concern crossing his face as he recognized her. "Pearl." He vaulted over the corral fence and strode to meet her as she dismounted. "What's wrong? Is everything all right in town?" "We need to talk, Flynn," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Something in her tone must have alerted him to the seriousness of the situation. His expression grew wary as he took the reins of her horse. "Let me take care of your mount and then we can go to the house." "No, I'd rather talk here, privately." Flynn nodded, leading the horse to a hitching post before turning back to face her. "What is it, Pearl?" Pearl took a deep breath. "Yesterday, Harold Jenkins came to the store. He told me about Tom Harris." Flynn went very still. "I see. Is it true? Did that drover die?" For a long moment, Flynn said nothing. Then he nodded once, his expression grim. "Yes, he died the next morning." "You let me believe he had lived," Pearl said, unable to keep the hurt from her voice. "You let me think the only consequence was Catherine ending your engagement." Flynn ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd come to recognize. "I never explicitly said he lived. But you didn't say he died either. By omission, you led me to believe something that wasn't true." Pearl wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warming day. "Why, Flynn? Why wouldn't you tell me the whole truth?" Flynn's eyes met hers, and in them she saw a depth of pain that caught her off guard. "Because I was afraid," he admitted quietly. "Afraid you'd look at me differently if you knew I'd taken a life. Afraid you'd walk away like Catherine did." The raw honesty in his voice made Pearl's heart ache. "I'm not Catherine, I know that, but the fear was still there." Flynn took a step toward her, then stopped when he saw her stiffen. "I've never told anyone how much it affected me, killing Harris, not even Finn. I see his face sometimes in my dreams, hear the sound he made when the bullet hit him." Pearl hadn't expected this, the evidence of how deeply the incident had scarred him. "It was self-defense," she said softly. "Mrs. Holloway told me the whole story. No one blamed you." "I blamed me," Flynn said simply. "Not for defending myself or the blacksmith's daughter, but for not finding another way. For being so good with a gun that my first instinct was to draw and fire." Understanding dawned on Pearl. "That's why you rarely wear your gun in town anymore." Flynn nodded. "I decided I didn't want to be the kind of man who solves problems with a bullet, even when it's justified." "Except when Jenkins was dragging me through the saloon," Pearl observed. "You were wearing your gun that day." "I had just come from a hunting trip," Flynn explained. "But yes, I was prepared to use it if necessary. Some things are worth fighting for." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. "I wish you had told me," Pearl said finally. "Not because it would have changed how I feel about you, but because secrets have a way of coming to light eventually. And hearing it from Jenkins, of all people." "I'm sorry," Flynn said, and she could see he meant it. "I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning." "Yes, you should have." Pearl looked at him steadily. "I need to know I can trust you, Flynn, that you won't hide things from me because you're afraid of how I might react. Marriage doesn't work that way." Flynn took another step toward her, and this time she didn't pull back. "You're right. And I promise you, Pearl Bennett, no more secrets between us. No more half-truths or omissions. I want to be worthy of your trust." "And I want to be worthy of yours," Pearl replied softly. "You should have known you could tell me anything, that I wouldn't judge you for defending yourself and others." Flynn reached for her hands, and after a moment's hesitation, she allowed him to take them in his. "Can you forgive me?" Pearl looked into his eyes, those deep blue eyes that had captured her attention from the first moment in the saloon, and saw the man she had come to love. Flawed, yes. Imperfect, certainly. But fundamentally good and honorable. "Yes," she said simply. "I forgive you." Relief washed over Flynn's features. He drew her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. "I love you, Pearl, more than I can say." "I love you too," she whispered against his chest. "Just don't shut me out again. Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Always." As they stood there in the early morning light, the ranch coming to life around them, Pearl felt the last of her doubts slip away. The path forward wouldn't always be smooth. Life rarely was, especially on the frontier, but they would walk it side by side, honestly and openly. And that, she realized, was all she had ever truly wanted. The first Saturday in October dawned clear and crisp, with just enough chill in the air to turn the aspen leaves to gold against the deep blue Colorado sky. Pearl stood at the window of the guest room at the Fraser Ranch, watching as the sun rose over the eastern hills, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. Today, she would become Mrs. Flynn Fraser. A soft knock at the door announced Sarah's arrival, her arms laden with Pearl's wedding dress, a creation of ivory satin and lace that they had labored over for weeks. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "More than ready," Pearl replied with absolute certainty. The weeks since their confrontation about Tom Harris had only strengthened Pearl and Flynn's relationship. True to his word, Flynn had opened up to her completely, sharing not only the details of the shooting but also his hopes and fears for their future together. In turn, Pearl had confided her own insecurities, her worry that she wouldn't be a good enough partner in the demanding life of a ranch wife, her lingering grief over her parents' deaths. Each confidence shared, each vulnerability exposed had brought them closer, building a foundation of trust and understanding that Pearl knew would serve them well in the years to come. Now, as Sarah helped her into the wedding dress, Pearl felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged, not in Boston, not as Harold Jenkins' mail-order bride, but here with Flynn, building a life together on the land he loved. "You look absolutely beautiful," Sarah declared when the last button was fastened and the veil arranged over Pearl's upswept hair. "Flynn won't know what hit him." Pearl smiled at her soon-to-be sister-in-law. "Thank you, Sarah, not just for helping with the dress, but for welcoming me into your family from the very beginning." "You were family from the moment Flynn brought you home that first Sunday," Sarah said, squeezing Pearl's hands. "I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Holloway peeked in, her eyes widening at the sight of Pearl in her wedding finery. "Oh my," she breathed. "You're a vision, dear." "Is everything ready?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Holloway nodded. "The ministers arrived and the guests are all seated in the garden. Finn says the groom is pacing like a caged mountain lion and driving everyone crazy." Pearl laughed, picturing Flynn's nervous energy. "Tell him I'll be right down." As the two women left to relay the message, Pearl took one last look in the mirror. The woman who gazed back at her was transformed from the frightened, humiliated girl who had been dragged through the saloon less than 5 months ago. Her eyes were clear and confident, her smile genuine, her posture straight and proud. "Thank you," she whispered to whatever fate or providence had brought her to Redemption Springs and into Flynn Fraser's path. Downstairs, she found Mr. Cooper waiting to escort her. With no family of her own present, the kindly merchant had offered to give her away, an offer that had touched Pearl deeply. "Miss Bennett," he said with genuine admiration, "you are a picture of loveliness today." "Thank you for doing this, Mr. Cooper," Pearl said, taking his offered arm. "It's my honor," he assured her. "And if I may say, Flynn Fraser is the luckiest man in the territory." Together, they stepped out into the garden, where chairs had been arranged in rows facing an arbor twined with autumn flowers and golden aspen boughs. Neighbors and friends from town filled the seats, all turning to watch as Pearl began her walk toward her future. But Pearl had eyes only for Flynn, waiting for her beneath the arbor. He stood tall and straight in a new black suit, his hair neatly combed, his blue eyes fixed on her with an expression of such love and wonder that it took her breath away. Beside him stood Finn as best man, holding little Samuel, who waved excitedly when he spotted his Auntie Pearl. On the opposite side, Sarah waited as matron of honor, beaming with happiness for her brother-in-law and friend. The ceremony itself passed in a blur for Pearl, the minister's words, the vows exchanged, the simple gold bands that symbolized their commitment. What she would remember most clearly was the moment Flynn lifted her veil and looked into her eyes with a depth of emotion that words could never express. "I love you, Mrs. Fraser," he whispered before kissing her for the first time as husband and wife. The kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of all they would share in the years to come. When they finally broke apart to the cheers and applause of their guests, Pearl felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The celebration that followed was everything a frontier wedding should be: abundant food, lively music, dancing that continued well into the evening. Even Mrs. Abernathy, known for her sharp tongue and critical eye, declared it the loveliest wedding Redemption Springs has ever seen. As twilight deepened into night, lanterns were lit around the garden, casting a warm glow over the festivities. Flynn found Pearl speaking with Mrs. Holloway and drew her aside, his expression both tender and mischievous. "I have something to show you," he said, taking her hand. "A wedding gift." Intrigued, Pearl allowed him to lead her away from the party, toward the paddock where Dawn, now a leggy 6-month-old filly, grazed alongside her mother. "I don't understand," Pearl said, looking from the horses to Flynn. "Dawn is yours," Flynn explained. "I've registered her in your name. When she's old enough, Finn will train her specially for you." Pearl's eyes widened in surprise and delight. "Flynn, that's too generous. She must be she's priceless," Flynn interrupted gently, "just like you, and it seemed fitting. You named her for a new beginning, and now she'll be part of ours." As if understanding she was being discussed, Dawn trotted over to the fence, nickering softly in greeting. Pearl reached out to stroke the filly's velvet nose, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of Flynn's gift. "Thank you," she said softly. "I love her, and I love you." Flynn drew her into his arms, his expression serious in the lantern light. "When I saw you in that saloon, something inside me that had been sleeping for a long time woke up. I didn't know then that I was looking at my future wife, but I knew you were someone special, someone worth fighting for." "And you did fight for me," Pearl reminded him. "Literally." Flynn chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her where she was pressed to his chest. "Best fight I ever picked, though I hope our marriage requires fewer fistfights than our courtship." "I don't know," Pearl teased. "There's something to be said for a husband who's willing to take on half the town to defend his wife's honor." "For you," Flynn said, his voice growing serious again, "I'd take on the whole territory if necessary. But I'd rather spend our years together building something than fighting. This ranch, our home, a family someday." "A family," Pearl echoed softly, imagining children with Flynn's blue eyes running through the meadows, riding beside their father as he checked the herds. "I'd like that very much." Flynn bent to kiss her again, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they finally returned to the celebration, hand in hand, Pearl knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the heart of a quiet cowboy who had fought for her when she needed him most. 1 year later, Pearl stood on the porch of the Fraser ranch house, watching as Flynn rode in from the northern pasture, silhouetted against the setting sun. In her arms, 2-month-old Emma Fraser slept peacefully, unaware of her mother's fond gaze or her father's approach. So much had changed in the year since their wedding. Pearl had fully embraced her role as a ranch wife, learning to ride with confidence on Dawn. who had indeed become a fine cutting horse under Finn's training, helping with the accounts, and even assisting during calving season when every pair of hands was needed. The most significant change, of course, was the tiny bundle in her arms. Emma had arrived in the heat of August, a healthy, strong, lunged girl with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that were already showing signs of turning as blue as her father's. Flynn dismounted at the corral gate, unsaddling his gelding with practiced efficiency before striding toward the house. His face lit up, as it always did, at the sight of Pearl and Emma waiting for him. "My two favorite ladies," he greeted them, pressing a kiss to Pearl's lips before gently touching Emma's downy head. "How was your day?" "Peaceful," Pearl replied, leading the way inside where supper waited. "Emma slept more than usual, which meant I finished the mending and even had time to bake an apple pie." "A man couldn't ask for more than that," Flynn said, washing his hands at the kitchen basin before taking his daughter carefully from Pearl's arms. "Hello, little one. Did you miss your pa today?" As if in answer, Emma's eyes fluttered open, and she regarded her father with a solemn expression that soon melted into a toothless smile. "She knows her pa," Pearl observed, setting plates on the table. "Smart girl," Flynn agreed proudly. "Just like her mother." Over supper, Flynn shared news from town. Cooper's store was expanding. The railroad was considering a spur line that would come within 10 miles of Redemption Springs, and Harold Jenkins had finally left the area, heading for California after one too many confrontations with the sheriff. "Good riddance," Pearl said without rancor. She had long since put the unpleasantness of her arrival behind her, though she would never forget how it had led her to Flynn. After the meal, they sat together on the porch swing, Emma nestled between them as they watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. In the distance, coyotes called to one another, and the soft lowing of cattle drifted on the evening breeze. "Are you happy, Pearl?" Flynn asked suddenly, his voice quiet in the gathering dusk. Pearl turned to look at her husband, this man who had fought for her honor, who had opened his heart and his home to her, who had given her a daughter and a future filled with purpose and love. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "Are you?" Flynn's arm tightened around her shoulders. "More than I ever thought possible." He gazed down at their sleeping daughter. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how lucky I am, if I hadn't been in that saloon that day." "But you were," Pearl reminded him. "And you stood up when no one else would." "Best decision I ever made," Flynn said simply. As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, secure in their love and the life they were building, Pearl reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come west seeking security and found a love greater than she had ever imagined possible. The mail-order bride who had been dragged through the saloon as a joke had become a respected rancher's wife, a mother, a valued member of the community. And it had all begun because a quiet cowboy had fought for her when she needed it most. "I love you, Flynn Fraser," Pearl whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And I love you, Pearl Fraser," he replied, his voice a rumble of contentment in the growing darkness. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come." In the night sky above them, stars winked like promises, and the land stretched out around them, their land, their home, the foundation of all they would build together in the years that lay ahead.